I really appreciate this opportunity. I am moderating because the experts are here with us, Dr. Sam and Dr. Yao. They are here with us. They are experts in matters of diaspora, and they have a lot to share on what is happening on people on the move and God on the move, because God is moving with his people. So very excited to have these two gentlemen share with us. I think those of us who are not in the area of mission training, this year we acquired a new vocabulary. And the vocabulary, for me, it was totally new, I must confess. Polycentric missions. So when I was asked to participate in writing a paper on polycentric mission, I even had to begin by going to Google to find out what is that, because missions training is not my area. And those of us who were here in the first session where Dr. Tit shared, a great professor who is very conversant with the many theological issues. You know that he said part of the divide between theology and evangelism is because of institutionalization of theological training. The fact that we have schools now, we have theological seminaries, and I happen to be based in a Christian university. So I do understand how we in the institutions contribute to the divide. And so that's why you find, even though I am a scholar, but and within where I should be getting the terminology, but because sometimes we don't work together. I am Christian educator. I am just working on my narrow side. So then it takes time to get to understand this other side of new developments. So the polycentric mission term is the idea about how people now do not have to come from the West to preach the gospel as missionaries to Africa, Latin America, and other parts of the world. It is the idea that the world has opened up, and now we can have people moving from anywhere to everywhere, or from everywhere to anywhere. I have heard even from anyone to everywhere. And I'm wondering, can we also say from everyone to anyone, from everyone to everywhere? You see, there are those terminology. And because we have the experts, I would like them to comment and tell us where do they see the bigger picture of the current state of Africans in the diaspora, and what is happening around there? How is that movement happening? And especially as we focus on this topic of theology and evangelism. So we will begin with Dr. Sam, and then Dr. Yao will go next.
Thank you, Professor Rosemary, and I'm very excited and glad to be here. I am based here in the U.S., in that Wheaton College, and I also teach at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where Professor Tino is our senior advisor professor and older brother and uncle to all of us. And I'm originally from India and lived in 5 different countries. My early career was in engineering and business. And after 10 years, felt sense of call to do something in missions and studied at 2 seminaries in the US and then went to UK. And I think it was Andrew Walls who really turned my eyes to the reality of migration. And I was taking a class with him, and then later on had the good fortune of doing my doctoral work under him. And they say, if you study with Andrew Walls, a little bit of Africa gets rubbed onto you. And that really happened with me. And I think in the last 10 years, I've been teaching and traveling through Africa. It's been a joy. I've learned more. than what I have taught, and many, many friends. And so my colleague, Dr. Bulus Galadima, he's a historian, and I just recently did a book on African diaspora and diasporas in Africa. And I think the phenomena of migration and diaspora is an important element to understand evangelism and mission in the current African context and in the global context. So I think it was Andrew Walls who said, migration is a more significant event in Christian history than the Reformation itself. Those of us in the Protestant evangelical traditions recognize the 16th century Reformation was a turning point in the history of contemporary and Western Christianity and global Christianity. And I think he said, as I argued with him, I had just done a class on Reformation theology and studying Luther and Calvin, and he was saying that, yes, migration is a most significant event. And he went on to cite how migration. So his argument largely stems from this reality that when Protestant Reformation emerged out of Europe, Europeans become migrants. And the migration of Europeans has created the Christianity as Western. And it also has that baggage of Western theology and export of that. And more recently, my good friend Jehu Hanselis says migration has done more to the spread of Christianity than the combined effect of all missionary action and missionary activities of the church. And so that's why we argue that every missionary is a migrant, and every migrant is a potential missionary. Or I would argue that they carry out the evangelistic missionary impulse of Christian faith. And so immigrant churches have grown. So where Christianity grows, it pushes its people out. Now with the growth of Christianity in Africa, record number of Africans are going around the world. And some of the largest churches in England are all Africans now. I studied in England, had to travel and minister in different cities, and I really saw some of the largest churches are all led by Africans. Some of the largest churches in Europe are led by Africans. So one of the largest churches north of us in Canada is an African led churches. So the phenomena of the growth of the church, now with some 700 million Christians in Africa, and Africans are becoming mobile and they're going places. And wherever they go, they establish their community immediately because they are, they say, every African Christian is a missionary in some way, whether it's your job, whether your studies, whether you're a doctor or engineer or software professional. No matter where you go, immediately you gather a few people and start your church. And so this is the phenomena of the global African church. So the Ghanaian churches in New York City or Nigerian churches in London and all major global cities, you can see African churches. And so this phenomena of the immigrant churches here in America too. We see many, many African congregations, but they have their unique challenges and issues. And that's why I want to focus in my remaining time. What are some immigrant communities? They are quick to establish their own diaspora communities. Like I come from part of India where its apostolic roots go back to 2,000 years. And Indians have traveled. Indians is one of the largest diaspora communities. And they're immediately quick to establish their own language-specific, culture-specific immigrant congregations. But then over a period of time, Chinese also have a long history of migration. And now the growth of the church in China and the spread of Chinese around the world. And that is something to closely monitor and study. And so we can see some of the unique challenges the African immigrant churches and all immigrant churches face when they go to a foreign land, establish their communities of faith, and what are some issues that are facing before them. One is very sporadic and large-scale the growth of the African immigrant church. And so African churches are popping up all over the place. In fact, some of the most, on a Sunday morning, you take a subway in London, a train, underground, you will see most people on the train are somebody of African origin. And so all of them are going to church Sunday morning. Sunday morning, last time, early few months ago, I was in London, I was taking underground. Sunday morning, the worship and prayer is going on in the underground train. And they were all heading to their church and they're praying and preparing for the worship. So that's the ethos or the unique African cultural spirit, whether they have that missionary passion, evangelistic passion in a foreign land, being uprooted and creating their communities elsewhere. So this phenomena is happening at a rapid pace. And but I think what happens is many of them becomes their own ethnic specific. So Nigerians will gather together and create their own Nigerian, maybe a Yoruba service or particular language specific or denomination specific Pentecostal groups, and Ghanaian Presbyterians or Kenyan Pentecostals will start their own communities, and then soon they will expand and include other people, other Africans. And so they tend to be becoming a Pan-African church. And then they want to become a multinational, multi-ethnic church. We want to invite our local Canadian colleagues or German colleagues into our church and our friends. And so this phenomena of including others into our churches creates unique dynamics within the church. And how Pentecostal do we remain? What are some practices back from Nigeria or South Africa is still relevant in this context? And what do we need to change and drop? That creates lots of unique challenges. Second challenge I would say is language. First generation wants to continue in certain languages, on their own ancestral mother tongue and their African languages. And but then their children are growing up in a foreign country. They don't understand these languages, and we lose that. So we lose our own children by preserving our African roots and African culturalized Christianity is what we have transported into foreign lands. So the challenge of language, how do we navigate through that? Do we remain African, or do I embrace a Western or English language or a German language as our dominant language of ethos? And what do I lose in the process? Because the African cultural Christianity cannot fully be done in English language in Canada or America. And so the struggle of language or losing the next generation. And so the generation issue is, how do I transmit an immigrant professional doctor in New York City from Accra, Ghana, will struggle about, they're trained in surgery or medicine, but they don't know how to do cross-culturally make the gospel relevant for the next generation who are growing up in a Western context, in English dominant and American New York culture. And so generational transfer of the gospel and the relevance of the gospel for the next generation will remain a challenge. Certain practices about worship style, music, all of that is challenging in diasporic context because more you want to preserve, more you are irrelevant in your context. But immigrant communities live on nostalgia. Monday through Friday, Saturday, you are in a foreign land. And how do I sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And I want to Sunday morning, I want to be transported back to my homeland, my community back in Africa. And I want to cherish and be, fed in the nostalgia of my childhood faith or my youth college university experience. If you're a young professional migrant who have come to America or Europe in the last 30 years or so. So I want to be transported back to my childhood faith. And so that becomes a challenge. And then how do I reach local host nation? And do I remain in an inward-looking African-only community, or what is my engagement with the host culture and the host peoples of the land, and going beyond, and how much I'm willing to sacrifice for the nostalgia and wanting to recreate things of my homeland. And then the other final questions will be, what is African diaspora church's role in the West? we have to discover that. And for example, here in Africa, here in America, we talk about African American Christianity and African immigrant Christianity. And those who came several generations ago, a few centuries ago, through slavery and others, forced migration, and those voluntary migrants who have come in the last 30 years or so. And so there is a kind of a struggle between that. And same is true in Europe and England particularly. And those who came from Caribbeans, to England, and those recent ones who are coming from West Africa and Southern Africa to England. And so these kind of how do I embrace the global African community, and how do I embrace my host country? And what do I have? How can I be as a missionary community and bring the gospel to the nation, which has sent missionaries to my forefathers in my my hometown in Africa? And so that mutuality and the reciprocity of the gospel and the debt that we owe, and at the same time understanding the new context of the West, and how do I engage, how do I share, how do we be a blessing, because to recognize that the modern dispersion, the scattering of the Africans is sovereignly orchestrated, as Paul would say. It's a God who has determined the time and the place where we should live. And now with the growth of the church in Africa, this missionary impulse, this migratory impulse is together goes for the missionary purposes of scattering God's people, God's chosen ones from Africa to all parts of the world. And then my final comment is, even as Africans are getting increasingly scattered, in the next 30 years, we will see more migration than previous 200 years. And in this reality, what is the African church in Africa recognizes its ends of the missions agenda, and how can you leverage your diasporas to bring the gospel through your people who have gone all over the world, and to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth. But even as Africans are going to the ends of the earth, it is time to recognize the ends of the earth will also come to Africa. More immigrants from more countries will come to live in your cities and your country. And so this reality of dispersion and the gathering of the nations in your own country. The world will come to Ghana and Nigeria and Kenya and Ethiopia. And how ready is the church in those countries to engage the world that is at your doorstep? And you don't have to send missionaries to China. Chinese are coming to Africa in a big way. India and Latin America will come increasingly to Africa. And so how can African church be ready for the world that will come to your city, your backyard? And how can we engage? Because by engaging them, you're engaging the world. So the whole paradigm of mission is not defined geographically. Mission is God's people moving, taking the gospel to the ends of the earth, and the people, for whatever reason, come to live next door to you, and you can be an agent of bringing the gospel truth and bearing witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ to your neighbors, to your new neighbors from around the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sam. That is excellent, and that's a great overview. And even not to mention that Africans are also migrating within Africa, so there are many dynamics there. And but today our focus is on the one on the West. So, Dr. Yao, you have been based in Canada, and you also travel quite a bit in your role, even as a staff of Lausanne. So there is much that you can tell us, and you can take the same approach as Dr. Sam and address the issue in you giving us the bigger picture, letting us know the situation in Canada and wherever else you want to mention, and giving us the challenges and opportunities that we have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's good to see Sam and I co-catalysts with the Lausanne movement. I focus on international students, which is a part of the bigger diaspora situation, which Sam catalyzes. Thank you for the opportunity to share. I'll share a few words and then we can get into some discussion. But we're talking about the issues of immigrant churches in the West. And if you had asked me 15 years ago that I'll be talking about this, I would have said you are crazy. But literally, the Lord spoke to my wife and I through the scriptures that in Genesis 12 of Abraham, leave your country, your people, and your father's household. And the next thing we knew, we're scattered. Within 6 months, we were in 3 different countries. And the rest is history, including the opportunity to pastor a Chinese church in Canada, which is also one of the phenomena I might mention later on, because not only are Africans pastoring African-started churches, now Africans are pastoring Korean churches, like your own husband, Steve, right, did in the US, or like I pastored a Chinese church. So it's an interesting phenomenon. Let me begin, though, in terms of overview, saying that let's not forget that the first really multi-ethnic church was the church in Antioch, right? It was started by believers who were scattered, and the word diaspora means scattered, right? Scattered by the persecution that followed the stoning of Stephen, right? If you remember. And that church was so multicultural, including Africans, and that's the church that sent out Paul, in Acts 13. And that's the church where believers were first called Christians, so something to be said for the immigrant church there. Now, the centuries prior to the 20th century saw massive migration of Africans into the diaspora, but it was forced. And some mentioned that. But since the last century, and particularly over the last 20 years, the significant migration has been voluntary, including highly trained professionals or other economic migrants due to perceived or real limited economic opportunity in their context. International students, refugees, there are those who go to the West for family reunion, get the family back together, or for mission work, either intentionally spiritual mission work, or they are part of the diplomatic corps. Now, as of January this year, there were approximately 43 million African migrants in the world. 43 million. Now, we're not talking about all people of African descent. We're just talking about people who actually move across international boundaries. Now, this number is a result of a 20-year trend of migration. Now, interestingly, like you mentioned, Professor Rosemary, most African migrants live within the African continent. So the majority move to nearby countries or nearby regions, right? But basically, about 14.5% of the global migrant population is African. And so when people give the impression that Africans are moving, it's true, but 41% of the migration in the world is Asian, 22.5% is European, right? And less than a third of African migrants actually live in Europe. 27% of all the 43 million live in Europe. So I'm sharing that for us to get some context, because sometimes it looks like, oh, the whole of Africa is moving. Oh, look at them in the Mediterranean. Look at them coming to overwhelm our systems in Europe, etc. We need to situate the context, the conversation well. So roughly, there are about 11 million African-born migrants in Europe. There are about 5 million African-born migrants in Asia, and about 3 million in North America, where Sam and I live. Sam is in the US, I'm in Canada, but today I'm actually in Ghana. I've actually moved back to Ghana with my family because of what God is doing with the continent now. We feel God is asking us to be back here to help deepen the discipleship of our people so that he can send us out. One of the significant things happening in Europe, since we're talking about the West, it's not only American, in Europe as well. One researcher said, for years we asked for revival in Europe, but when it came, we did not recognize it because it was Black. And like Sam is saying, many of the biggest churches, the most vibrant churches in Europe today, actually either started or certainly pastored by Africans. So in terms of immigrant churches themselves, let me state maybe 3 or 4 things, and then I'll come about what we need, talk about what we need to do to make better use of what God is doing, because it is really God who's moving. Migration is a God thing. People move because God is on the move. Paul made it very clear in Acts chapter 17 that it is God who determines our times and our locations. So people movements are God movements. And throughout the book of Acts, we see that. And as we're seeing in our world as well, when people move, the gospel moves. People either move to get to know God or get to spread him. So a few issues with regarding the state of the African or immigrant diaspora churches. Number one is diversity. So African immigrant churches in Canada, for example, and the US too, are diverse. They are very small ones, which are very African-like. I know some of them in Montreal and in New York City, etc. But they're also very large, multi-ethnic ones, like one by Dr. Samowu. So you can check, Calvary Church in Vancouver, in British Columbia. This was started by this Ghanaian pastor, and yet it is the most multinational church in the world. 150 nationalities. It has been one of those churches that has broken through that barrier that Africans only start African churches, right? You could also check out, I've put in the chat a podcast we did with Dr. Sunday Adeleja of Nigeria. He basically pastors the largest church in Europe. 99% of his church in Ukraine, in Kiev, are white Ukrainians. So I'm saying that African immigrant churches are diverse. They are small, very African ones, to the very large multinational ones. The other thing is connections. There are a variety of connections of these churches in the West with organizations within Africa. So most of these are actually transnational churches, right? So most African immigrant churches have strong connections with churches back in Nigeria, let's say Redeemed Church of God or the Church of Pentecost in Canada, or in Ghana, right? Or the Methodist Church in Canada has a connection with the Methodist Church back in Ghana. And then when it comes to liturgical practices, African Christian migrant churches are known for their use of loud music, synthesizers, percussions, loud prayers. And apart from the dual lingua franca of Canada, which are French and English, many still use native African language like some Kiswahili, some Chi, some Igbo, and Yoruba here and there. African churches, one thing Africans haven't left behind, even when they've come to North America, is prayer. African churches are known to pray. In fact, even Samawusu's church, which is very multinational, 150 nationalities, they have brought their all-night prayer meetings from Africa there. So now you have all these nationalities who are praying like Africans, so to speak. When people say, let's pray the Korean style of prayer, I laugh because I say you haven't seen the Africans pray, right? The other phenomenon is that there are quite a number of cases where African diaspora are called to pastor other non-African immigrant churches, like I did with the Chinese, as I mentioned. Now, the crux of the matter is this. Some African immigrant churches have the goal to reform Canadian society, or American society for that matter, and bring Christianity back to the West, which is a truly noble and missional objective. But I dare say that the majority of the churches are really not missional churches this way. They are more like chaplaincies that give succor and social support and spiritual upliftment to fellow Africans. In other words, they are in these, and I've been to many of them from New York to name it, and they have all these communities around them as a church, Latino community, Chinese community, whatever. And yet the church is like they parachute from wherever they come from and come and have church and then go back to wherever they come from, totally not looking like the communities they are founding, right? And that begs the question whether they are missional, because if you want to know whether a church is missional, it must look like the community it's in, right? So somebody asked, is your church missional? The way to know is if you are taken out of here, will the people here miss you? And I dare say that for many African immigrant churches, if they move from that location, the community wouldn't miss them. They're not engaging the community in meaningful ways for the community to say, oh, the people of God have left here. I see the time. Let me round up and then we can have kind of a Q&A. So we've got to ride the wave. It is God who has created this wave. Just like Acts 1:8, those who have been scattered preach the gospel wherever they went. As African people scatter, we also need to preach the gospel wherever we go. But first of all, do we realize that we need training? In 2022, Quiver did a research. It's an international collaborative that I lead. We interviewed African Christian international students, and you find that article in the book Sam mentioned, Africans in Diaspora, Diasporas in Africa. I mentioned that study there. 16 African countries were interviewed. And these African Christian international students, half of them did not consider themselves as missionaries, as God was sending them all over the world. And by the way, after France, China is the next biggest destination of African international students. There are about 500,000 African international students in the world. Half of these guys said, the Christians, we don't even consider ourselves as missionaries. Even the other half that consider themselves as missionaries, 34% had never taken any mission training at all. Kairos, perspectives, name it. So there are many, many challenges and opportunities when it comes to this wave that God himself is building. But I'll say that I'll wrap all of these challenges, opportunities in just two things: missional discipleship and total mobilization. We need the kind of discipleship, deep discipleship in Africa that prepares every African to have a missional identity and purpose. So that whether God sends you to Afghanistan or you end up in Zimbabwe, you know you're on mission with God for God. And total mobilization also because there are three levels of mobilization: discovery, development, deployment. Level one, which is discovery, is about helping all of God's people, like I just mentioned in terms of missional discipleship, right? Understand scripture, the history of mission, strategy, culture, all of that, develop a missional worldview and missional discipleship. But level two is specialized training and equipping for God's people for specific ministry skills. Like Sam George was mentioning, what does a doctor in New York City, an African doctor in New York City, how do they prepare to share with the Muslim community or the Gujarati community in New York City? That is level two, specialized training and equipping of God's people. And then there's level three, which is proper sending of these missionaries, and proper missionary care. So I think I can end here, except maybe to add that a lot of us, we're talking about evangelism, and theology and missiology. A lot of us are trained that evangelism is only, a lot of us are trained as if evangelism equals mission. And a lot of Africans need to be retrained that evangelism is a part of mission, but it's not the whole of mission, because we are missing many opportunities because and again, many of us also only know proclamation evangelism. It's one of the blessings we are bringing to the West, because many are shying away from proclamation evangelism, unlike the people of Billy Graham's era. So it's a gift we are bringing back, just like prayer. But at the same time, we also need to be trained in the process of disciple making. We need to be trained in friendship evangelism. We need to be trained that people can first come for food and fun, and in the process develop relationships and find faith. So those are some things that come to mind. We need our mission organizations and our institutions to take seriously cross-cultural sensitivity and skills. We can't do things the way we did in Africa and expect to prosper in America or Canada or Europe for that matter. But whatever training we do, if it first doesn't touch our identity, we've lost it. Because quite a number of all the challenges, and please read the book Africa's Arrest, we list so many challenges with this new African phenomenon. But a lot of our challenges are actually rooted in identity. Some of us think Black is inferior. How are you going to cooperate in a polycentric mission world on equal terms if you think Black is inferior? How are you going to preach to a white man or a woman if you think that Black is inferior? We tried that on the University of Ghana campus. Some of the students will not go to the international students hostel to do evangelism. Why? They said, but these people are white people. They already know God. So, and then somebody said, how can I, a Black person, go and tell an American about Jesus? We are sick in the head. We need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Again, many of us haven't gone into our biblical and historical roots as African Christians. If we did, we'll realize that Christianity is not a white man's religion. No. So can a Black man be a missionary? Whatever training we do, it must transform us by the renewal of our minds. Otherwise, we won't get the job done. Thank you. You're muted, Rosemary.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Yao. It seems like Dr. Sam dropped off, and so that means that you are the one who will address.
Oh, he's back.
Yeah,
I'm here. I'm here.
Okay,
I'm back.
Okay, you are back. So welcome back, and what we will do before you come and maybe give a parting shot, there is one question. We only have time for one question because it's we were supposed to be ending at 5, and so we don't want to keep people. So there is this question given from Sophia. Given the challenges of language barriers, cultural assimilation, and the tendency to form ethnically homogeneous groups in diaspora settings, how can missionaries effectively practice polycentric evangelism that transcends these limitations and fosters cross-cultural connections and ensures the gospel is accessible and impactful to diverse communities? I think Dr. Yao actually has addressed a bit of that, so we can hear from Dr. Sam, his thoughts. Yeah.
I would say that, the homogeneity and tribality, tribal notion of our faith is, we want to create churches of people just like us because the gospel advances the fastest. All of that was a 20th century mission reality. But the 21st century, more people are going to be in touch with more people who are unlike them. And they will also travel and be exposed to realities at a wider world. So we got to think in terms of heterogeneity. Heterogeneity simply means diversity, variety, cultural plurality, and relevance, because this will be an essential life skill in the 21st century context. We will be interacting with people from many different worlds and many different places and cultural and languages. So create and cultivate a multilingual and multicultural and multi-world, truly a global sense of identity and competency and ability to relate and minister and connect with people of diverse background. So this will be a core trait of how heterogeneous can you become, how many cultures that you can embrace and include in your church and worship, rather than creating an exclusive club, because missionary nature comes from this cross-cultural process. And, and sometimes we think about migrants, but sometimes we got to look at 3-4 generation to understand the story of Christianity and its spread. So this large-scale out-migration from Africa and migration within the continent of Africa, we got to look at what God will do in 100 years from now, beyond our lifetime. And our children's generation, what will happen. Look at Moses. He was a 4th generation on his father's side, 3rd generation on his mother's side. He became a deliverer because he navigated the Hebrew culture, bondage of the Hebrew people, and able to speak to the Pharaoh in Egyptian court. Look at Paul. Paul was 2nd, 3rd generation, a kid from Asia Minor, grew up in Roman citizen, grew up in a Hellenized world. Hebrew kid goes back to Jerusalem and learns the scripture and become an exceptional missionary. It is this cross-cultural skills that helps them to take the gospel to many places, and your propensity towards travel and ability to connect with many different people arose out of this cross-cultural skills. And so we must disciple our people to become global Christian. One of the founders of Lausanne movement was John Stott. John Stott used to say that we had to help our people to become global Christians because our God is a global God. Our Savior is a universal Savior. Our God is not a tribal, localized God. And he is the one, the incarnation comes to the particularity. Jesus was born in this December season. We celebrate Christmas, is the birth of Christ to a particular geography and a place and a time. Then he tells his disciples to go to the ends of the earth, which requires universality. So this particularity and universality intersects in the world of migration and diaspora. And the migrants are, in next 2-3 generations, they'll become multi-ethnic, multi-skills, and ability to connect with all people from all over the world. And I think every church must catch a vision for the ends of the earth. And every Christian has to become a global Christian, because if you are becoming more like Christ, we must have a heart for people who are unlike me. The way I caught a burden for Africa. I caught a burden for Chinese people. It is in my migrant wanderings as an Indian, I came across all these people and they become part of my life now. And I've become part of their lives. And it's enriched us and my understanding of my faith and the God who is on the move, because God's people are on the move. It is God's sovereign agenda in the ends of the earth and the end of time, to the spread of the gospel to all people everywhere. You're muted, Rosemary.
Yeah, it's they are prohibiting unmuting, self-unmuting, so that's why it is the delays. They are so sorry about that. Thank you so much, Dr. Sam, and it is well said, and we can have a parting shot also from Dr. Yao. And if there are any questions, please put them on the chat. As the moderator of the day said, those questions will be responded to and it will be distributed. So, Dr. Yao, your parting shot. Thank you so much.
You're muted. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, what a privilege to be alive at this time. To think that just 150 years ago, our continent was called a dark continent by some. But look at us today. The stone that the builders rejected has become a chief cornerstone. It is the Lord's doing, and it's wonderful in our eyes. Whenever I go around the world and tell people that Africa is the most Christian continent in the world today, I have to add an adjective. Africa is the most numerically Christian continent in the world today, because the numbers are there, but we are not seeing it necessarily in the day-to-day life, in our socioeconomics, in our corruption index, and things like that. And so what I want to say is that, yes, God is sending us to the ends of the earth, but before mission is going anywhere, mission is first being God's kind of people, that countercultural people. And that is our challenge. And that is the deeper missional discipleship I'm talking about, that will understand that God will use us as salt and light where we are, so that when a Chinese comes from wherever they come to Africa, they come and meet God's kind of people, not a crook meeting a crook. And then when we go somewhere else, God sends us somewhere else, centrifugal. We go because, again, we are salt and light. And when we receive people, again, we are salt and light. So we are not only the most numerically Christian continent, we are also the youngest continent. And so this conversation we are having should really seek down to the youth, because by 2050, almost half of all the youth in the world, 15 to 24, will be African. I don't think it's an accident that God has made this continent. I know we say mission is now everywhere to where. It's actually one of the things I was not happy about in the Congress. It is true that mission is everywhere to everywhere, but we should have spent a little time to celebrate what God is doing in Africa, because anyway, so yes, God is raising Africa to reach the world with the gospel. I pray that we'll be prepared, in terms of cross-cultural sensitivity and cross-cultural skills. But none of that will matter if our minds are not correct. So first, may God transform us by the renewing of our minds, so that we don't even go just planting. A lot of the churches we are planting in the West, they are franchises. We are just making franchises of our churches. No, that we'll really go and disciple the nations. And as we disciple the nations, church planting will result. But if we just go planting our brands and our flags, it does not necessarily result in disciple making. May God help Africa for such a time as this.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your input, and I feel like in both your concluding remarks, you are reminding us about the clarion call that we got from Lausanne, that fulfilling the mission will need us to work together in collaboration, and so that we can display Christ together. And therefore, theological institutions, the church, evangelists, theologians, and we have learned today there is no difference. We are one body. We need to work together. There is no divide, and it should not be encouraged. We work together to preach the gospel of Christ fully.